Now, again, to me, the timing is incredibly suspicious. We are less than 2 months out from the election. This is something that happened nearly 2 years ago.
Welcome to The Political Independent, your weekly home for a refreshingly nonpartisan take on the news, as well as thought-provoking discussions on how to improve the American political process. Now here is your host, Gregory Anderson.
Welcome, my friends, to episode number 7 of the podcast. I hope you had a fantastic week and an even better Labor Day holiday with your family. Mine was okay. Honestly, I'm still frustrated about what's going on in the Big Ten. Unfortunately, they've allowed politics to creep into the situation. It sounds like we may get an actual vote today, on Tuesday, and hopefully that happens, and hopefully they make the right decision, because the NFL, high school, and college are actually playing right now, so we'll see. We have a great show for you today. There's only a couple stories that I would like to discuss. Well, I guess that doesn't actually accurately describe the first topic, because I really don't want to talk about it because I consider it a non-story at this point, but it allows us to bring up a larger point about anonymous sourcing. And I'm, of course, talking about Trump's reported comments about dead soldiers on a trip 2 years ago. So, like I said, it helps us bring up a larger point, and that's why I want to discuss it. So the next story also lets us reinforce a point that we made in Tuesday's episode from last week about being cautious, waiting for more information, not rushing to judgment, showing patience, because it's really important. Now, there's been a lot of more details coming out of what happened in Portland with the Trump supporter being shot and killed by the Antifa member. Turns out he also has been shot and killed by federal officials when they were attempting to arrest him. But specifically talking about what happened with the shooting of the Trump supporter himself, it was originally reported that he was acting in self-defense. It turns out that that is not true. So we're going to talk about that story in some detail. And then to end the podcast, I have one thread from r/centrist. And it's called There Is Middle Ground. And there isn't much to it, but I thought it was just an excellent point that was made in this thread and in some of the comments. And I really want to bring it up because it's going to help come up with ways as far as bringing more people under our tent, especially our non-voters, but also even some partisans who are frustrated with the climate also, and actually harbor some opinions from the other side of the aisle. So I think it's really important. But first, let's talk about these comments.
Vice President Joe Biden is joining prominent veterans in demanding President Trump apologize after an article in The Atlantic alleged the president made disparaging remarks about America's fallen heroes. Mr. Trump vigorously denies the charge. Boda Yimam is at the White House.
The White House pushback has been swift for a reason. This article has the potential to damage a strong subset of voters, veterans, and military families, some of whom have already crafted an open letter calling for the president to apologize. The president played a round of golf this afternoon after spending the morning on the attack again over a bombshell report in The Atlantic magazine that alleges Mr. Trump called soldiers who were killed in action, quote, losers and suckers.
It was a terrible thing that somebody could say the kind of things, and especially to me, because I've done more for the military than almost anybody else.
I wasn't originally planning to talk about this. I think the timing is suspicious. There isn't enough evidence about this. And also, I'm also someone who talks a lot about waiting for more evidence. But I think this story allows us to bring up a larger point, and that is anonymous sourcing. I think it's just valuable information for us to learn about. There was an article that came out in the Washington Post, it was roughly 3 years ago, that talks about this very subject, and it's directly relevant to this story. And I think maybe going over this article may convince you otherwise, may convince you to believe that Trump actually made the comments, but I'm somewhat skeptical, and I'm going to continue to wait for more information. And apparently, there's going to be more coming out, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But let's give some background information on the story itself. This headline roundup from all sides is titled, "Report Claims Trump Made Disparaging Remarks About Military Service Members." This comes from September 4th, 2020. On Wednesday, an article published by The Atlantic reported that, according to anonymous sources, President Trump previously made several strongly worded disparaging comments about military service members, including those who died in World War I. The report also alleges that in 2018, Trump asked that wounded veterans be removed from planned military parades. Trump denies making the comments on Thursday, calling the reports fake news, which is something he tends to say about a lot of things, and suggests the sources are liars. White House spokesman Alyssa Farah said the report has no basis in fact. Now, the Associated Press, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others cited sources confirming Trump's disparaging comments, including a senior Defense Department official with firsthand knowledge of the events, a senior U.S. Marine Corps officer who was told about Trump's comments, a former senior administration official, and people familiar with Trump's comments. Now, Fox actually cited two sources who were on the trip in question, refuting the claim that Trump canceled the 2018 trip to the World War I cemetery because the dead soldiers were, in quote, suckers. Now, if we flip over to that article that they're referencing on Fox, two sources who were on the trip in question with Trump refuted the main thesis of The Atlantic's reporting that Trump canceled the trip to Ann Marne because he believed the dead soldiers were losers. The White House said at the time of the decision was made because of poor weather for flying Marine One and the fact that the cemetery was too far a distance for the motorcade to drive. Now, one thing that wasn't mentioned in the headline roundup from all sides is that John Bolton actually came out and denied the comments. He was on that particular trip, and he also added the caveat that, hey, he could have said it later on in the day, but during this particular trip when he was with him, he did not say these particular comments. So really, at this point, we're weighing the anonymous sources from the Atlantic story versus someone who actually decided to go on the record. But I'll talk a little bit about that, in my opinion, on it later. So let's head over to the Washington Post. So like I said, this article came out 3 years ago. Well, almost 3 years ago. This was from Margaret Sullivan. It's titled, "How Do You Use an Anonymous Source? The Mysteries of Journalism Everyone Should Know." And that's exactly why I'm going to talk about it. So the story, again, is almost from 3 years ago, December 10th, 2017. But again, it lays out some of the information about how anonymous sources are used, which, hey, I learned some things about this, and I think this is very valuable for people who don't know. When Houston Chronicle reporters want to use information from an unnamed source in a news story, they first have to jump through a few hoops first. A senior editor has to approve it and know who the source is. A single unnamed source is rarely enough to go ahead with a story. There must be at least two sources with the same firsthand knowledge, and one handful of top editors must sign off on its use before publication. Now, did all that happen before the Atlantic article? I have no idea. The one exception to this two-source rule is when we have a golden source. For an example, the police chief talking about an investigation, said Nancy Barnes, the Chronicle's executive editor. The vetting process is similar at many large organizations, and it's just one of the many practices that journalists assume, perhaps incorrectly, that news customers understand. Anonymous sourcing is one of the least understood mysteries. A lot of people seem to think when we use anonymous sources, we don't even know who they are, that they are anonymous to us, said the Washington Post reporter Wesley Lowry. That's definitely not the case. Anonymity is granted to sources under tightly controlled circumstances because they cannot speak on the record and their names attached for a variety of reasons. News sources try to limit their use, embarking on crackdowns and then sometimes backsliding. Peter Barker, a reporter at the Washington Bureau for the New York Times, said, to a surprise reaction at a journalist conference last week, that Times Washington reporters no longer use blank quotes, direct quotations with no names attached. I asked a few prominent journalists to describe what they wish news customers knew about our business, but probably don't. I was prompted to do so after the undercover provocateurs known as Project Veritas released a video featuring a Post reporter and then crowed about their supposed expose. The video showed him describing how harshly critical of President Trump he has found the Post staff. Now, that's hardly a secret. The editorials, which represent the consensus of the paper's editorial board, are published after all. But Project Veritas was taking advantage of the fact that news customers don't make a distinction between news reporters and editorial writers. No, there's a reason why people may think that, and that's because writers and reporters themselves have blurred those lines. So I'm not going to blame people for that, and this is just a pretty shoddy way of abdicating responsibility. Inside the Post building, though, the split is clear. News reporters and news site editors strive for impartiality. They want to keep their opinions out of their work. By contrast, editorial writers and columnists are not only allowed to have an opinion, it's their job description. What would some of these experienced news people like you to know? Ben Smith, the editor-in-chief at BuzzFeed, told me he wished readers would understand that sourcing isn't always simple. A high-profile source isn't always a hero and may have motivations that have little to do with serving the best interests of our democracy. I've always wished that the public understood how complex and messy sourcing is and how often sources' motives are personal or complex. While I appreciate the romantic portrayal of reporters and sources in movies like The Post and the whistleblowers from Daniel Ellsberg to the Me Too voices are truly heroes, Mark Felt is much more of a typical source, Smith said, referring to the former FBI official who became the Watergate source known as Deep Throat, in part because he had an axe to grind against the Nixon-era Justice Department. Smith added that reporting is an ethically complicated business, whose responsibility is singularity to deliver true stories to the audience. But how journalists get there can be discomforting, he observed. BuzzFeed's recent expose of alleged sexual misconduct by Representative John Conyers, he's a Democrat from Michigan, told readers that its information was supplied by Mike Cernovich, the far-right media personality who has promoted conspiracy theories. I don't think people widely understand how hard journalists work to get the story right, which sure thing. Accuracy is the first requirement journalists have of each other. For instance, while considering hiring or promotion, corrections, even uncorrected mistakes, are badges of dishonor. Of course, journalists do mess up sometimes. They also can fall prey to confirmation bias, allow anonymous sources to run amok, fail to be fair and impartial. Perhaps most often and most foolishly, they can move too fast to publish in a highly competitive environment. And then, in a business based on credibility, there's a price to pay. So that was pretty much the end of the article. Now, there are some pieces that I didn't read that wasn't necessarily relevant to what we were talking about, but I thought that was interesting. That it sounds like they try to do their best, and sometimes you can't necessarily trust what you get from these sources because they may have their own motivations. Now, I think we have to extrapolate what we just talked about when it comes to anonymous sourcing and talk about Trump's supposed comments. Now, again, to me, the timing is incredibly suspicious. We are less than 2 months from today out from the election. This is something that happened nearly 2 years ago. And if you look at the sourcing, so it says a senior U.S. Marine Corps official who was told about Trump's comments. So that's somebody with secondhand knowledge. A former senior administration official. So that could be first or second or third or who even knows how far down the road. And then people familiar with Trump's comments. So to me, like when you look at just that information altogether, especially with people not wanting to go on the record, it's extremely hard for me to take just that information of what we have now and believe that he actually made the comments. Now, as many people have pointed out, and I have to be fair, Trump did make very disparaging comments about John McCain, who passed away. He seems to have some weird axe to grind against him. And it's unnecessary. It's sad. And it's one of the many things that people don't like about him. But given the knowledge that he made those comments, it does make this story plausible. But that doesn't mean that it's true. It doesn't mean that this story is actually factual. And that's been my biggest issue. Now, to me, there's a series of concessions that you have to make to reach this conclusion that he actually made the comments based off the information that we have right now. And one of the main things is that we have John Bolton, who apparently was on the trip, who said that he did make the comments, at least at the time in which it was alleged. So you can say, oh, well, I don't believe John Bolton. But you don't believe John Bolton, but yet you believe anonymous sources who won't go on the record. So to me, the whole thing just sounds ridiculous and a little set up, to be honest. So again, he could have said it, and you could have talked about this at the time in 2018. But we waited to right before the election to drop these comments. I'm sorry. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if some stuff about Joe Biden comes out too. I mean, this is going to be a messy election cycle, so be prepared for more. Actually, if you go to The Hill, they did an article on this saying that there should be more coming out. And this was from Jeffrey Goldberg, the person who actually wrote the story.
I think there is, horror is the right word, across the national security complex of people who have devoted their careers to protecting the United States. There is a sense of horror about the way he acts and behaves and talks. And so I would fully expect, let me just say it this way, I would fully expect more reporting to come out about this and more confirmation and new pieces of information in the coming days and weeks.
Yeah, but why grant anonymity in the first place? Help viewers at home understand how this works. Obviously, these sources are not anonymous to you. You know their names. You know why they are credible. And you're attaching your own credibility to them by granting them anonymity.
Right, of course. And as Jennifer Griffin on Fox said, and I thought this was a great quote, she said, these are not people who are anonymous to me. I mean, yes, we know if you're a good reporter and you're going to quote somebody anonymously, you better have faith in what they're saying. It's a complicated thing, as you well know. We all have to use anonymous sources, especially in a climate in which the President of the United States tries to actively intimidate journalism organizations and people who provide information to journalism organizations.
Right-winger Aaron J. Danielson, he claims in self-defense.
They're trying to make me look like a murderer.
He was identified by the black fist tattoo on the side of his neck. His whereabouts were a mystery until he gave an interview to Vice News.
You feel that it was totally justified?
Totally justified. Had I not acted, I am confident that my friend and I'm sure I would have been killed.
Former U.S. Marshal John Muffler.
If you're using cell phones and laptops, anything with an electronic signature, it can be tracked. I would say that the interview he did could have been a potential lead.
Here's the timeline. 2 p.m. West Coast time. Vice News reveals that they have scored the interview with Reinold. Freelance journalist Donovan Farley posts, I've been working nonstop for the past few days. I hope you'll check it out. 7:30 p.m. Reinold leaves an apartment building in Lacey, Washington, where he had been hiding out, 120 miles north of Portland. U.S. Marshals and local authorities are waiting for him.
There was shots that were fired into the vehicle, and the subject fled from the vehicle, at which time there was additional shots that were fired.
Wait for more information. I talked about this last week, and this story that we're getting ready to talk about, like I said earlier, reinforces the need for patience. Suspect in Patriot Prayer shooting killed by police. Media coverage differs. So this is a headline roundup from all sides. I believe Thursday we're actually just going to talk about all sides and more. I had that chance for the interview on Thursday, so that's why I put this episode off. But we're definitely going to talk about all sides coming on Thursday. And more websites like it. On Thursday evening, a federal fugitive task force shot Michael Reinold when he allegedly tried to elude arrest. Reinl, a self-described anti-fascist, was charged with second-degree murder with a weapon and unlawful use of the said weapon in the August 29th shooting of Aaron Danielson. Official accounts of Reinl's death from law enforcement differ slightly. The Thurston County Sheriff's Department said in a press briefing that Reinl was running away when he was shot dead by officers with the Fugitive Task Force, while the U.S. Marshals leading the task force said they attempted to peacefully arrest Reinl and shot him when he produced a firearm, threatening the lives of law enforcement officers. Now, according to a police affidavit, until Friday, Reinl appears to have been targeted by Danielson when he was wearing a cap bearing the symbol of a right-wing group, Patriot Prayers, at the time of the shooting. Reinl reportedly waited in an enclave of a parking garage before emerging and firing 2 gunshots, one of which proved to be fatal. In an interview shortly before his death, Reinl told Vice that he was acting in self-defense. Again, that's not true. Coverage from left-rated sources tended to highlight the discrepancies in official accounts of Reinl's death. Coverage from some right-rated sources, coverage from some center and right-rated sources tended to highlight Reinl's as an Antifa and Black Lives Matter supporter, and also highlighted Reinl's potential targeting of Danielson. Some right-rated outlets also criticized left-rated outlets for reportedly downplaying Reinl's Antifa ties. Now, the sources that they used for that story were the Oregonian, like that's the weirdest name for a paper, but you'll have the link. Fox News and then CBS. So that pretty much is the end of the story. Of course, more information is going to come out from this, but I thought it was worthy of getting an update, and again pointing out that we need to wait for more information. Just like in this, that's why I really haven't talked too much in detail, even though we went over some of the differences in how the story was covered about the shooting in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where Rittenhouse killed the 2 protesters. And as I was talking about in the last episode, I think that was something that could have been avoided. Just like this shooting could have been avoided, because he particularly targeted this man, and it's truly sad. And that's what the normalization of political violence over the last, I would say, nearly 12 years is not good. It's not good. And that's why we need some sort of balance in our politics. So, final story of the day, and I guess it's not really a story, it's just a thread over on r/Centrist, but I thought it was something interesting and I wanted to bring it to you. It's titled, "There is a Middle Ground." After reading a lot of posts, I see that a lot of people don't think that every political idea has to be either or. I'm one of those people. You can support gun ownership and still want more restrictions on assault rifles and more stringent background checks. You can support the need for oil and gas exploration and realize that green energy is our future and needs to be invested in. You can be against open borders and still support a fast track to citizenship. You can support a lot of progressive ideas and still ask how they're going to be paid for without being taxed out the wazoo. You have a mind of your own. See through the bullshit. Vote accordingly. No, I implore you to go check out the thread because actually some of the comments are kind of funny. But it's a really good point about the lack of tolerance for people who hold these type of views. Now, if you remember a while ago, Tomi Lahren got in trouble for this. Now, she got her start on Facebook. If you remember a while ago, she used to make a lot of viral videos talking about politics. Well, eventually, before she went to Fox, she actually got her start, I believe, at The Blaze, that I believe is owned by Glenn Beck. Now, a while ago, she made some pro-choice comments, which got her fired, which is sad. And I find this frustrating is because you meet people in your daily life, and I know I have, people who aren't these crazy partisans, people who do hold views such as this, like there is a common thing that's said about Black people that we are more socially conservative. That is an accurate statement. I know this from talking to various family members and just other Black folks that I've met, whether when I lived in Georgia, when I visited Texas, when I was out in California. It's true. It doesn't necessarily have to be about race, but just anyone. There's many people across the country who have views that are considered conservative and liberal. I mean, it happens often. Like, there's a lot of crossover. That's why there was crossover between the appeal of Bernie and Trump. That's why you were able to get some Bernie supporters from 2016 to vote for Trump, and who at this point have switched parties. So, and that's one of the things that I find just weird, is that millions of people, like a large swath of the public, hold views that are conservative and liberal, yet they are not represented in the media. And that's why I do the show. That's why I do this show, because we're going to eventually expand, and I want to likely expand out this segment to talk more about left-wing and right-wing views, because, again, we're all about finding pragmatic solutions, and we got to talk about them in detail, have more people on, and I will be doing that. We actually have a couple more interviews planned already, and we need to show that, hey, people can hold views that are conservative and liberal. We can have conversations. We can find solutions. There is indeed a middle ground. Well, that's it for the Political Independent. If you'd like to reach me, do so at politicpodcast@gmail.com. We will have a podcast episode on Thursday, unless some act of God happens, but we will have a podcast on Thursday. I would like to go over all sides, F1's media, and really how to organize how you follow the news based off of how much time you have. So I'm going to introduce you to some new apps, websites, and things that are helpful as you begin to become more engaged with politics. And again, it's going to help you get a well-rounded view of stories. So I think you should definitely tune in on Thursday, and I will see you then.
Thank you for listening to The Political Independent. Please head over to iTunes, Google Play, CastBox, Overcast, or wherever you are listening to this podcast, and leave a rating and review. Thanks again for listening.